Marcus Johnson stared out the car window as his mother drove him to his new school. Moving in the middle of junior year wasn't easy, but his mom's promotion meant a better life for them both. Still, starting over at Westfield Academy made his stomach twist with nerves. "You'll do great," his mother said, squeezing his hand. "Your grades from Central High were excellent. Just be yourself." Marcus nodded, adjusting his backpack. He had always been a good student. At his old school, teachers often used his papers as examples, but being the new kid, especially the new black kid at a mostly white school, brought its own challenges. The main building of Westfield Academy looked impressive with its brick walls and large windows. Students walked in groups across the front lawn, laughing and talking. Marcus took a deep breath and stepped out of the car. "I'll pick you up at 3:30, his mother called. "Good luck." The school hallways buzzed with activity. Marcus found his locker and checked his schedule. First period, AP History with Ms. Harrington, room 203. When Marcus entered the classroom, most seats were already taken. He chose an empty desk near the front and took out his notebook. A few students glanced his way, but no one said hello. Ms. Harrington walked in just as the bell rang. She was tall with gray-streaked brown hair pulled into a tight bun. Her eyes scanned the room as she took attendance, pausing slightly when she reached Marcus's name. "Marcus Johnson," she called, looking up. "Here." Marcus raised his hand with a small smile. Ms. Harrington merely nodded and continued, not returning his smile. During the lesson about World War II, Marcus listened carefully and took detailed notes. When Ms. Harrington asked a question about the Pacific Theater, Marcus raised his hand. Several other students did too, but she called on each of them before finally turning to Marcus, even though his hand had been up first. "Yes, Mr. Johnson," she said, her voice noticeably cooler than when addressing other students. The Battle of Midway was a turning point because it stopped Japanese expansion in the Pacific and gave the United States its first major victory. Marcus answered confidently. Ms. Harrington's lips tightened. "That's correct, but incomplete. As I mentioned earlier, it was also the first time U.S. intelligence played a crucial role by breaking Japanese codes." She turned away quickly, not acknowledging that Marcus's answer had actually been completely correct. Marcus frowned slightly. He hadn't missed anything in her earlier explanation about code breaking. Later, when Ms. Harrington handed out assignment sheets for their first paper, she stopped at Marcus's desk. "This class maintains very high standards," she said loudly enough for nearby students to hear. "I hope you can keep up with our pace." A girl sitting nearby gave Marcus a sympathetic look. "I'm Sophie," she whispered when Ms. Harrington walked away. "Don't worry about her. She's tough on everyone." But as class continued, Marcus noticed it wasn't the same for everyone. When a white student named Jason gave an incomplete answer, Ms. Harrington helped him expand his thoughts. When Marcus offered an insight about historical perspectives, she quickly moved on without comment. By the end of class, Marcus felt a weight settling on his shoulders. As students packed up their things, he heard Ms. Harrington tell another teacher in the hallway, "We have a new student from Central High. We'll see if he can handle the academic rigor here." Marcus gripped his backpack straps tightly. He recognized what was happening. He'd faced it before at his old school before the administration changed, but he wouldn't let it stop him. He needed this education, these opportunities. Just the first day, he muttered to himself as he headed to his next class, "I'll show her what I can do." 2 weeks passed, and Marcus's situation in Ms. Harrington's class only got worse. Every day, he came prepared, completed all assignments, and participated in discussions. Yet, Ms. Harrington seemed determined to find fault with everything he did. Today, Marcus sat at his desk, staring at his latest essay. A large red C marked the top corner. He flipped through the pages, reading Ms. Harrington's comments. "Underdeveloped ideas, lacks scholarly approach, needs more evidence." Next to him, Sophie was looking at her paper with a smile. "What did you get?" she asked. "C-," Marcus replied quietly. Sophie's eyes widened. "What? Let me see that." She took his paper and read through it quickly. "This is so much better than mine, and I got an A-. That's not right." Marcus shrugged, trying to hide his frustration. "Maybe my writing style is different from what she wants." "No, Marcus, I've seen 3 of your papers now. You're one of the best writers in class." Across the room, Jason was showing off his B-plus paper to friends. Marcus had helped Jason with that assignment during study hall, explaining concepts Jason hadn't understood. Somehow, Jason's work deserved a B+, while Marcus's more thorough analysis earned a C. Marcus pulled out his notebook and made another tally mark. He had started documenting every instance of unfair treatment. 14 times Ms. Harrington had ignored his raised hand. 6 times she had cut him off mid-answer. 3 papers graded significantly lower than similar work by white classmates. "You're keeping track?" Sophie whispered, noticing his notebook. Marcus nodded. "My mom always says, if something feels wrong, gather evidence before you speak up." After class, Marcus approached Ms. Harrington's desk. He waited politely until she looked up from her computer. "Ms. Harrington, I was hoping you could help me understand what I need to improve on my essay." She barely glanced at the paper. "As I noted, your analysis lacks depth. Your sources aren't as scholarly as I expect in an AP course. I used the same database the school librarian recommended, and I cited 5 academic sources," Marcus explained calmly. Ms. Harrington's expression hardened. "Mr. Johnson, perhaps this level of coursework isn't suitable for everyone. Some students find the AP curriculum too challenging." A few students still gathering their things nearby fell silent, clearly listening. "I've maintained a 4.0 GPA throughout high school, including AP classes at my previous school," Marcus said, keeping his voice even despite the anger building inside him. "Different schools have different standards," Ms. Harrington replied dismissively. "If you'll excuse me, I have a department meeting to attend." She stood up and walked out, leaving Marcus standing there with his C paper. Sophie approached him. "That was completely unfair. Have you talked to anyone else about this?" "Not yet. I wanted to give her a chance to explain first." "You should tell Mr. Torres. He's the guidance counselor, and he's really good about this stuff." On his way to lunch, Marcus stopped by the guidance office and requested an appointment with Mr. Torres. The secretary scheduled him for the following day. That evening, Marcus sat at his desk at home, carefully reviewing his latest history paper. He had spent hours on it, checking and double-checking his facts, crafting clear arguments, and citing reliable sources. Yet Ms. Harrington had dismissed it as mediocre work. His mother knocked on his open door. "Everything okay, honey? You've been quiet since I picked you up." Marcus hesitated, then handed her his paper. "I think something's not right with my history teacher, Mom." She read through the paper and his teacher's comments, her expression growing increasingly concerned. "This is excellent work, Marcus. Much better than a C-." "I know," Marcus said quietly, "and it's not just the grades. It's how she treats me compared to the other students." His mother sat on the edge of his bed. "Do you want me to talk to her?" Marcus shook his head. "Not yet. I have an appointment with the guidance counselor tomorrow. I want to try handling this myself first." "I'm proud of you," she said, squeezing his shoulder. "Just remember, you know your worth. Don't let anyone make you doubt that." The classroom fell silent as Ms. Harrington walked between the desks, handing back the major research papers. This assignment counted for 40% of their final grade, and everyone had spent weeks working on it. "Remember," Ms. Harrington announced, "this paper reflects your ability to conduct serious academic research. Your grades represent the quality of your work, nothing more and nothing less." Marcus sat up straight, filled with hope. He had chosen to write about the civil rights movement, focusing on lesser-known activists who worked alongside Martin Luther King Jr. For this paper, he had gone beyond the school's resources, visiting the city library and interviewing his grandfather, who had participated in the Montgomery bus boycott. When Ms. Harrington reached his desk, she placed his paper face down without making eye contact. Marcus noticed she had smiled encouragingly at several other students. With a deep breath, he turned over his paper. A large red F stared back at him. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face. He quickly flipped through the pages, looking for comments that might explain such a terrible grade. There were only a few brief notes. Inadequate research, poor understanding of historical context, and failed to meet academic standards. There must be some mistake, he whispered to himself. Across the aisle, Sophie looked over with concern. She mouthed, "What did you get?" When Marcus showed her the F, her jaw dropped in shock. "That's impossible," she said, keeping her voice low. Can I see it after class? Marcus nodded, still stunned. He had never received an F on anything in his academic career. When the bell rang, students gathered their things and filed out. Marcus stayed in his seat, trying to process what had happened. Sophie waited for him by the door. I need to speak with Ms. Harrington, Marcus told her. Want me to wait? No, but thanks. This might take a while. After the classroom emptied, Marcus approached Ms. Harrington's desk. She continued typing on her computer, ignoring him for nearly a full minute before looking up with an impatient expression. Yes, Mr. Johnson. Ms. Harrington, I don't understand this grade, Marcus said, placing his paper on her desk. I followed all the guidelines and put more work into this than anything I've written before. She barely glanced at his paper. The grade reflects the quality of your work. But there's hardly any feedback explaining what I did wrong, Marcus persisted. How can I improve if I don't know what the problems were? Ms. Harrington sighed loudly. Your research was superficial, your analysis lacked depth, and your writing was disorganized. You clearly didn't put in the effort required for an AP course. I interviewed my grandfather who actually participated in the events, Marcus explained. I cited 15 scholarly sources and included primary documents. My paper is 20 pages long. Personal anecdotes aren't academic sources, she said dismissively, and quantity doesn't equal quality. Marcus felt his chest tighten, but he kept his voice calm. Sophie got an A on her paper about World War II fashion changes. She told me she used 5 sources and wrote 12 pages. Ms. Harrington's face hardened. Are you accusing me of something, Mr. Johnson? No, ma'am. I'm just trying to understand how to improve. Some students naturally grasp historical analysis better than others, she said coldly. Perhaps you should consider dropping to regular history next semester. Outside the classroom, Marcus found Sophie waiting despite what he told her. When she saw his face, she pulled him aside to a quiet corner of the hallway. Let me see that paper again, she said. Marcus handed it to her, and she read through it carefully. This is college-level work, Marcus. I can't believe she failed you. She said my research was superficial and my writing was disorganized. Sophie shook her head in disbelief. That's completely false. Your paper is way better organized than mine. What should I do? Marcus asked quietly. Talk to Mr. Torres like you planned. This isn't right, and it's not just this one assignment. It's been happening all semester. Marcus nodded, clutching the failed paper in his hand. I have an appointment with him tomorrow. Good. And Marcus, don't let her make you doubt yourself. This paper deserves an A, and we both know it. As they walked to their next class, Marcus felt a mix of anger and determination growing inside him. This wasn't just about one bad grade anymore. It was about justice and standing up for himself. The next morning, Marcus sat in the waiting area outside Mr. Torres's office. His failed paper and notebook of documented incidents rested on his lap. A knot of anxiety tightened in his stomach as he waited. What if Mr. Torres didn't believe him? What if speaking up made things worse? The door opened, and Mr. Torres appeared with a friendly smile. He was in his mid-30s with curly black hair and glasses. Students liked him because he actually listened when they talked. Come on in, Marcus, he said, gesturing toward the comfortable chairs in his office. Once they were seated, Mr. Torres leaned forward. So, what can I help you with today? Marcus took a deep breath. It's about Ms. Harrington's AP history class. I'm having some issues with the way she's grading my work and treating me compared to other students. Mr. Torres's expression remained neutral. Can you tell me more about that? Marcus placed his failed research paper on the desk. This is my major research paper. It's worth 40% of our final grade, and Ms. Harrington gave me an F. Mr. Torres picked up the paper and began reading through it, occasionally nodding. After several minutes, he looked up with a puzzled expression. This is excellent work, Marcus. Your thesis is clear, your research is thorough, and your writing is strong. I'm not seeing anything that would justify a failing grade. That's what I thought too, Marcus said, relieved that someone else saw what he saw. But it's not just this paper. It's been happening all semester. He opened his notebook and showed Mr. Torres his documentation. Dates, incidents, comparisons between his grades, and those of white classmates on similar work. Mr. Torrey studied the notebook carefully, his expression growing more concerned with each page. You've been very thorough in documenting this. That was smart. My mom always taught me to gather evidence before making claims, Marcus explained. I wanted to be sure before I said anything. Have you discussed this with your mother? Yes, last night. She wanted to come with me today, but I asked to try handling it myself first. Marcus hesitated. Mr. Torres, I don't want to accuse anyone of anything, but you're wondering if there's racial bias involved, Mr. Torres finished gently. Marcus nodded, relieved he didn't have to say it. It's a serious concern, Mr. Torres acknowledged. And based on what you've shown me, I think you have reason to be concerned. He leaned back in his chair. Here's what makes this complicated, Marcus. Miss Harrington has been teaching here for 25 years. She has a lot of influence with the administration and the school board. So nothing can be done. Marcus asked, his heart sinking. I didn't say that, Mr. Torres replied quickly. But we need to be strategic about how we address this. He thought for a moment. The first step would be to request a formal meeting with Ms. Harrington. You have the right to bring a parent or guardian to that meeting. And if that doesn't help, then we escalate to the principal. The new principal is starting next week, and from what I've heard, Dr. Johnson is very committed to fairness and equity in education. Marcus considered this. Do you think Ms. Harrington will change her mind about my grade? Mr. Torrey sighed. I can't promise that, but even if she doesn't, we're creating a record. We're showing that you raised concerns appropriately and followed proper channels. I don't want special treatment, Marcus said firmly. I just want to be graded fairly, like everyone else. That's not special treatment, Marcus. That's just basic fairness, and you absolutely deserve it. As their meeting ended, Mr. Torres stood up. I'll email Ms. Harrington to set up that meeting. Would you prefer Monday after school or Tuesday during your study hall? Tuesday, Marcus decided, and I'll bring my mom. Good. In the meantime, keep doing your best work and continue documenting anything that seems unfair. Mr. Torres handed back the research paper. And Marcus, I'm proud of you for speaking up. It takes courage to address something like this. Walking to his next class, Marcus felt lighter than he had in weeks. He still didn't know if Ms. Harrington would change the grade or stop treating him differently. But he wasn't facing this alone anymore. And for now, that was enough. Tuesday afternoon arrived quickly. Marcus and his mother, Mrs. Diane Johnson, sat waiting outside Ms. Harrington's classroom. Remember, Mrs. Johnson whispered, straightening her blazer, stay calm and stick to the facts. Don't let her provoke you into saying something emotional. Marcus nodded. His mother worked as a hospital administrator and knew how to handle difficult conversations professionally. He was grateful she was here. Mr. Torres arrived first, greeting them warmly. Ms. Harrington should be here any minute, he said, checking his watch. At 3:40, Ms. Harrington finally appeared, walking briskly down the hallway. She carried a leather portfolio and wore an expression of mild annoyance. I have a busy schedule today, she announced instead of greeting them. Let's make this quick. Inside the classroom, they sat around Ms. Harrington's desk. Mr. Torres started the meeting. Thank you for making time for us, Ms. Harrington. Marcus and his mother have some concerns about his grades in your class, particularly his recent research paper. Ms. Harrington's lips tightened. I grade all students according to the same standards. Marcus received the grade his work deserved. Mrs. Johnson spoke up, her voice calm but firm. Ms. Harrington, I've reviewed my son's paper carefully. I'm not an educator, but I am a professional who reads and evaluates reports every day. His work shows thorough research, clear organization, and thoughtful analysis. With all due respect, Mrs. Johnson, you're not qualified to evaluate academic work. Ms. Harrington replied dismissively. Perhaps not, Mrs. Johnson acknowledged. But Mr. Torres has also reviewed it, and he found no justification for a failing grade. Ms. Harrington glanced at Mr. Torres with surprise, then quickly recovered. Different teachers have different standards. In my professional opinion, the paper failed to meet AP-level expectations. Marcus opened his folder and pulled out several papers. I brought examples of A and B papers from other students who gave me permission to share their work. My paper is at least equal in quality, if not better. Ms. Harrington's face flushed. Are you accusing me of grading unfairly? We're simply trying to understand the specific reasons for Marcus's failing grade, Mr. Torres interjected smoothly. The feedback on his paper was minimal, which makes it difficult for him to improve. Some students need more structure and guidance to succeed, Ms. Harrington said, her voice taking on a condescending tone. Not everyone is cut out for advanced coursework, regardless of what their previous schools may have told them. Mrs. Johnson's eyes narrowed slightly. My son maintained a 4.0 GPA at his previous school, including in AP courses. He scored in the 98th percentile on his PSAT. What specific aspects of his paper didn't meet your standards? Cornered, Ms. Harrington flipped through Marcus's paper. The sources are inadequate. The analysis lacks depth. The conclusion is weak. Could you point to specific paragraphs that demonstrate these problems? Marcus asked. Ms. Harrington's mouth tightened into a thin line. I don't have time to go through this line by line. My grading stands. Mrs. Johnson leaned forward. Ms. Harrington, my son has documented a pattern of unfair treatment in your class. His work consistently receives lower grades than similar or even inferior work from other students. He's been ignored when he raises his hand and cut off when speaking. That's absurd, Ms. Harrington snapped. If you're implying what I think you're implying, I've been teaching for 25 years without a single complaint of bias. Until now, Mrs. Johnson said quietly. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. Mr. Torres cleared his throat. Since we seem to be at an impasse, I suggest we take this matter to the principal, he said. Dr. Johnson started yesterday and... Dr. Johnson? Ms. Harrington interrupted, suddenly alert. The new principal is here already? I thought she wasn't starting until next week. She arrived early to get settled before meeting all the faculty, Mr. Torres explained. Shall I schedule a meeting with her for tomorrow morning? Ms. Harrington seemed flustered now. That won't be necessary. Perhaps I should review Marcus's paper again. Maybe I was hasty in my evaluation. I think we're past that point, Mrs. Johnson said firmly, standing up. We'll meet with the principal as Mr. Torres suggested. This isn't just about one paper anymore. As they gathered their things to leave, Ms. Harrington's confident demeanor had visibly cracked. She watched them with an uneasy expression, especially Mrs. Johnson. We can go to the main office now to schedule that meeting, Mr. Torres suggested as they stepped into the hallway. Excellent idea, Mrs. Johnson agreed. The sooner we resolve this, the better. The next morning, Marcus and his mother arrived at school 30 minutes before classes began. The main office was quiet, with only the secretary and a few early arriving teachers present. Good morning, Mrs. Johnson said to the secretary. We have an appointment with Dr. Johnson at 7:30. Yes, she's expecting you. Go right in, the secretary replied, gesturing toward the door marked principal. As they approached the principal's office, Mr. Torres joined them in the hallway. I'll be sitting in as Marcus's guidance counselor, if that's all right with you, he said. Mrs. Johnson nodded gratefully. Of course. Thank you for your support. When they knocked on the door, a warm voice called, Come in. They entered to find a spacious office that had been transformed from the previous principal's dark, traditional decor. The walls now held colorful educational posters, student artwork, and framed degrees. Behind the large desk sat a woman in her early 40s with a professional but approachable appearance. Dr. Evelyn Johnson stood up with a bright smile. Good morning. Please have a seat. Ms. Harrington, who was already sitting in one of the chairs, turned to look at them. Her usual confident expression faltered when she saw Mrs. Johnson. She blinked rapidly and looked between Mrs. Johnson and the principal with growing confusion. You're? Ms. Harrington began, but her voice trailed off. Dr. Johnson's smile widened. I believe you've already met my sister-in-law, Diane Johnson, and my nephew, Marcus. The color drained from Ms. Harrington's face as the realization hit her. The student she had been treating unfairly was the new principal's nephew. I didn't realize there was a connection, Ms. Harrington stammered. Why would you? Dr. Johnson replied pleasantly. Johnson is a common name, and I was hired based on my qualifications, not my family connections. She turned to Marcus and his mother. Though I must say, it's a lovely surprise to have family nearby in my new position. Mrs. Johnson stepped forward and hugged her sister-in-law briefly. We were planning to tell you about the situation at Sunday dinner, but it seems more urgent now. Dr. Johnson's expression grew serious. Yes, Mr. Torres emailed me the details. Let's discuss this properly. She sat down and opened a folder on her desk. I've reviewed Marcus's paper and compared it with the assignment guidelines. I've also looked at samples of other students' work that received higher grades. Ms. Harrington shifted uncomfortably in her chair. Dr. Johnson, if I had known that Marcus was my nephew. Dr. Johnson interrupted, her voice suddenly sharp. That shouldn't matter, Ms. Harrington. Every student deserves fair treatment regardless of who their family is or isn't. Marcus watched in amazement. His aunt was handling this with such professionalism, not letting their family relationship overshadow the real issue. Let me be clear, Dr. Johnson continued. I've spent the last 15 years of my career focused on educational equity. Before accepting this position, I turned around 3 struggling school districts by implementing fair assessment practices and addressing implicit bias among faculty. She opened another folder and pulled out several sheets of paper. I also took the liberty of reviewing Marcus's previous assignments from your class, Ms. Harrington. I noticed a concerning pattern. Ms. Harrington's face had gone from pale to flushed. With all due respect, Dr. Johnson, you've only been here for 2 days. Perhaps you should take more time to understand our school's standards before making judgments. The room fell silent. Mr. Torres looked at the floor, clearly uncomfortable with Ms. Harrington's response. Mrs. Johnson raised an eyebrow but remained quiet. Dr. Johnson folded her hands on the desk. I understand you've been teaching here for 25 years, Ms. Harrington. That's an impressive career. However, longevity doesn't exempt anyone from accountability. She turned to Marcus with a kind smile. Marcus, based on my review, your research paper deserves an A, not an F, but this isn't just about one assignment, is it? Marcus shook his head. No, ma'am, it's been happening all semester. Dr. Johnson nodded thoughtfully. Then we have a serious situation to address, and we will address it, thoroughly and fairly. Ms. Harrington stared at the new principal, finally understanding that everything was about to change at Westfield Academy. The next week at Westfield Academy was unlike anything students or teachers had ever experienced. Dr. Johnson moved with remarkable efficiency, turning what could have been a quiet investigation into a school-wide examination of grading practices. On Monday morning, Dr. Johnson made an announcement over the intercom. Good morning, Westfield. As your new principal, I want to ensure every student receives fair treatment and evaluation. Today, we begin a comprehensive review of our grading practices across all departments. Marcus sat in his first period English class, listening as whispers spread through the room. By lunchtime, everyone was talking about the announcement. While most students didn't know the specific reason for the review, rumors were flying. I heard Ms. Harrington is in big trouble, Sophie whispered as she sat next to Marcus in the cafeteria. She looked like she'd seen a ghost during second period. Marcus just nodded, careful not to add to the gossip. His aunt had asked him to keep the details private while the investigation proceeded. After school, Dr. Johnson assembled a committee of 5 respected teachers from different departments and the district's educational assessment specialist. Their task: review a random selection of graded work from every teacher, with student names removed. We're looking for consistency and fairness, Dr. Johnson explained to the committee. Are similar quality assignments receiving similar grades regardless of who completed them? For 3 days, the committee worked after school hours, examining hundreds of assignments. Marcus's documentation proved invaluable, pointing them toward specific examples to investigate. On Thursday, Ms. Harrington was noticeably absent. The substitute teacher, Mr. Blackwell, explained that he would be taking over AP History for the time being. During passing period, Marcus overheard 2 teachers talking in low voices. I can't believe what they found in her gradebook, one whispered. 20 years of the same pattern, and nobody noticed? Or nobody wanted to notice, the other replied. You know how much influence she had with the old principal. On Friday afternoon, all teachers were required to attend an emergency faculty meeting. Students were dismissed early, but the teachers remained for 3 hours. When they emerged, many looked shocked or deep in thought. A few were openly upset. That evening, Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Sophie. "Did you see the email to all parents? Big changes coming." He checked his mother's email and found a lengthy message from Dr. Johnson to all Westfield families. It outlined several immediate changes to school policies. 1. All major assignments would now be graded using standardized rubrics that students could see in advance. 2. For final exams and major projects, student names would be replaced with ID numbers to ensure anonymous grading. 3. A new process allowed students to request review of any grade they believed was unfair. 4. Mandatory professional development on bias and equitable assessment would begin next week for all staff. The email didn't mention Ms. Harrington specifically, but the last paragraph was clear. "We have placed a faculty member on administrative leave, pending further review. We take allegations of discriminatory practices very seriously and will always prioritize student welfare and educational equity." Saturday morning, Dr. Evelyn Johnson arrived at her brother's house for breakfast. Marcus opened the door with a smile. "There's my favorite nephew," she said, hugging him. "I'm your only nephew, Aunt Evelyn," Marcus laughed. In the kitchen, his mother was making pancakes. "The whole town is talking about you, Evelyn," she said. "Making big changes already." Dr. Johnson sighed as she sat down. The committee found evidence of biased grading affecting multiple minority students, not just Marcus. Some patterns go back years. "What happens to Ms. Harrington?" Marcus asked quietly. "That's still being determined," his aunt replied. "She's on administrative leave while the district reviews all the evidence. But regardless of the outcome for her, we're fixing the system that allowed this to happen." She reached across the table and squeezed Marcus's hand. "What you did took real courage. By speaking up, you've helped more students than you know." "I just wanted to be treated fairly," Marcus said. "And that's exactly what every student deserves," Dr. Johnson replied. "Thanks to you, we're one step closer to making sure they all get it." Outside, the morning sunlight streamed through the window, bright with promise for a new day and a changing school. 2 months had passed since the investigation began. Spring sunshine warmed the Westfield Academy campus as students hurried to their classes. Marcus walked confidently through the main hallway, no longer feeling like an outsider. "Hey, Marcus. Wait up," Sophie called, jogging to catch up with him. "Did you finish your speech for the assembly?" "Almost," Marcus replied. "I'm still working on the conclusion. It's not easy summing up everything that's happened. Today was special, the official launch of the Student Advocacy Group, a new organization that had grown from the changes at Westfield. Marcus, as the founding president, would address the entire school. When they reached the AP history classroom, they found Mr. Blackwell arranging materials for the day's lesson. The substitute teacher had become permanent after the school board's final decision regarding Ms. Harrington. "Good morning, you two," Mr. Blackwell greeted them. "Ready for the big assembly this afternoon, Marcus?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Marcus smiled nervously. Class proceeded smoothly, with active discussions and equal participation from all students. The changes were visible everywhere, rubrics attached to every assignment, anonymous submission policies for major projects, and a new atmosphere of fairness that had transformed the school culture. At lunch, Marcus sat with several members of the newly formed Student Advocacy Group. They were reviewing their plans for the upcoming semester, workshops on educational equity, a peer mentoring program, and regular meetings with administration to address student concerns. "I still can't believe how much has changed," said Jason, who had become one of Marcus's friends after apologizing for not speaking up about Ms. Harrington's unfair treatment. "Remember how scared everyone was to question a teacher's grade?" "That fear kept the system going," Marcus replied. "But it only took a few people willing to stand up to change everything." After lunch, students and teachers gathered in the auditorium. The front row was reserved for special guests, including Marcus's mother and Mr. Torres, who had been key supporters throughout the process. Dr. Johnson took the stage first. "Good afternoon, Westfield Academy. We gather today not just to launch a new student organization, but to celebrate a turning point in our school's history." She described the changes implemented over the past 2 months. Ms. Harrington had been permanently removed from her position following the investigation, which had revealed a 20-year pattern of discriminatory grading affecting dozens of minority students. Anonymous grading procedures were now standard practice across all departments. Every teacher had completed training on recognizing and addressing implicit bias. These changes didn't happen by accident, Dr. Johnson continued. They'd happened because one student had the courage to speak up, to document what was happening, and to follow the proper channels to address it. I'm proud to introduce that student, our Student Advocacy Group President, Marcus Johnson. The audience applauded as Marcus walked to the podium. Looking out at the sea of faces, he took a deep breath. 2 months ago, I was the new kid who felt alone facing an unfair situation, he began. Today, I'm part of a community that's committed to making sure no student ever feels that way again. Marcus explained how the Student Advocacy Group would work to maintain the positive changes and address new challenges as they arose. He emphasized that educational equity wasn't just about race, but about ensuring fair treatment for everyone regardless of background, learning style, or personal circumstances. What happened with Ms. Harrington wasn't about one bad teacher, Marcus concluded. It was about a system that allowed unfairness to continue unchallenged. By working together, students, teachers, and administration, we've created something better, and we're just getting started. The audience rose in a standing ovation. Marcus spotted his mother wiping away tears, while Mr. Torres gave him a thumbs up from the front row. Dr. Johnson stood nearby, her face filled with pride for both her nephew and her school. After the assembly, as students filed out to their classes, a freshman girl approached Marcus. I just wanted to say thank you, she said quietly. Last year at my old school, I had a similar situation, but nobody believed me. Seeing what happened here gives me hope. Marcus smiled, understanding exactly how she felt. That's what this is all about, he said, making sure everyone's voice is heard. As he walked to his next class, Marcus reflected on how much had changed. What had begun as a personal struggle for fairness had transformed an entire school community. The failing grade that once felt like the end of the world had become the beginning of something much more important.